What is up, my fellow frosties? Today I bring you a video covering all things Frostmage in Castle Nathria. I'll be going boss by boss explaining conduit and legendary choices, plus some tips and tricks I've picked up along the way. In my Frostmage Ultimate Mythic Plus Guide video, I had a lot of comments about how some people find written information just as useful. If you would like a written form of topics I cover in this video, please check out Toegrinder's written mage guide linked in the description below. He also has a page containing up-to-date sims for covenants, legendaries, trinkets, and a ton of other useful information. Both are linked in the description. Okay, let's jump straight into it. First things first, let's talk about raid legendaries. The two main legendaries you'll want for Castle Nathria would be Slick Ice and Freezing Winds. Slick Ice causes your Frostbolt casts while your Icy Veins is active to increase the damage and reduce the cast time of Frostbolt by 2%, stacking up to 10 times. It's our best legendary for single target. Craft in the leg slot with crit haste. Freezing Winds grants you a Finger of Frost proc every 2 seconds while Frozen Orb is active. It's an extremely powerful legendary for funneling and it's great on 2+ targets. Craft in the head slot with crit haste. As a small side note, you'll see glacial fragments for some fights on logs. This is because it can be viable on some fights for some pad damage, but the other two legendaries are much more optimal. The talent setup for every encounter will be the same, shown here. If you would like an in-depth breakdown of talents, please check out my Ultimate Frostmage guide linked below. It's time-stamped so you can find the segment really easy. It's a lengthy chunk to explain it all again for the second time, so to keep things short and sweet in this video, I will refrain from deep diving once again, as the talents will stay the same for every encounter. Up next is Covenants and Soulbinds. I'll provide a visual single target raid talent path for each Soulbind, so feel free to pause the video if you'd like to study it some more. The top Covenant for single target raid is Venthyr. Both Nadija and Theotar provide similar DPS, with Nadija being the popular choice. These are the single target talent paths. The second Covenant is Necrolord. You can choose Emily for your Soulbind. The third Covenant is Night Fae, with Naya being your chosen Soulbind. The fourth Covenant is Kyrian. Pelaghost is your chosen Soulbind. To follow this up, let's discuss conduits. I will start with the generic Mage potency conduits and then follow up with Covenant-specific potency conduits. You always want to take Icy Propulsion. Every time you get a crit inside your Icy Veins window, it reduces the cooldown on Icy Veins depending on the item level of the conduit. The second potency conduit you want to take is Ice Bite, which increases the damage of Ice Lance depending on the item level of the conduit. If you are Venthyr, some fights that are single target will cause you to take Dauntless Duelist rather than a second potency. This conduit causes the first target you damage to be marked as your adversary, meaning they take 3% increased damage from you, while you take 1.5% less damage from them. You can only have one adversary at a time. The only time this will switch target is when your current adversary dies. It will switch to the first target you damage. A niche situation to note here is that a 226 item level Ice Bite on a mage close to crit cap tends to equal with Dauntless Duelist even on single target, so please take note of this. If you find yourself in this situation, bear it in mind through this video as you will be the exception to the rest. Bottom line, always sim your character. If you are Night Fae, pure single target fights will require you to run Naya's Tools Burrs and not a second potency conduit. Once again, don't forget to sim. Next up are Finesse conduits. None of these are DPS related. The most popular option here is Flow of Time, which reduces the cooldown of your blink. The next three are very niche and situational. Incantation of Swiftness grants you movement speed when casting your invisibility spell. This movement speed burst can be very valuable, especially if you mistime something. For example, taking seeds on Xy'Mox when you don't have both blink charges spare. Winter's Protection reduces the cooldown of your ice block, again, useful in niche situations. Grounding Surge reduces the cooldown of your interrupt when you successfully interrupt an enemy. As you can imagine, this isn't so useful within a raiding environment. It could be quite handy on fights like Inerva, where the adds have an important cast that needs to be kept interrupted. Endurance conduits are also not DPS related. Diverted Energy is very strong due to healing you for up to 13.2% of your maximum health if you have HP missing before casting Ice Barrier. This conduit is excellent for progress and for the fights in general. The other two are quite niche. Tempest Barrier provides a small shield after you use Shimmer, or blink if using the Ice Blaze talent. This can be useful in niche situations, however the way the fights are designed, you aren't going to shimmer enough for the conduit to be worth it. Also, on most fights, you won't be able to spare the shimmer charges just to gain a small shield. Cryo Freeze is also powerful as it can heal you for a large portion of your health. However, the goal isn't to sit in an ice block for extended periods of time. Okay, now that we're better equipped, let's go over the raid fight by fight and discuss how to approach it. Before I continue, just quickly, I'd like to note that I will be going over an approximate way to sim each fight. However, please bear in mind that just like Mythic Plus, there's no reliable way to sim encounters specifically. So run a few different settings and take the results with a slight pinch of salt. Mage APLs aren't built for hectic adcleave, light movement and the rest, so please always select patchwork to make sure the sim gives accurate results. Default sim settings are the go-to for most of the fights, which is just patchwork, one boss, 5 minutes. I'll mention these settings quite a lot. As a final point, don't forget to take note of how many trinkets your raid has so you can set these settings accurately. Okay, up first is Shriekwing. This boss is complete single target, and that's the basis of our decisions here. The legendary you will want for this boss would be our best single target Lego, which is Slick Ice. The conduits you'll want to take are Icy Propulsion and Ice Bite. If you are Venthir, Dauntless Duelist is better than having a second potency, unless you're in this niche situation that I mentioned before. If you are Night Fae, Naya's Tall Spurs is also better than having a second potency. As for simming, the default sim settings are what you would use for this fight. Moving swiftly along, the next boss is Huntsman Altimor. This boss is a 2-target fight for the majority, therefore that's our basis for decision making. The legendary you'll want for this boss is Freezing Winds. The conduits you'll want to take are Icy Propulsion and Ice Bite. If you're Venthir or Night Fae, take notes here as you will be swapping to double potency for this fight. Don't forget your tome! As the boss is 2+ targets, you will want to cast Blizzard on cooldown. Blizzard shouldn't be above spending procs, but it should be above using Frostbolt. Other than this, there are no rotational changes. It's worth noting your polymorph works on the shades that need CCing, so if your raid leader calls for a CC, you are a class capable of this. To sim for this boss, you would use the default sim settings, but you would change from 1 boss to 2. Up next is Hungering Destroyer. This boss is another pure single target fight. The legendary you take is Slick Ice. It's worth noting that on fights with a ton of potential movement, Slick Ice can lose some value. You need to have especially good uptime to get the most out of the Slick Ice stacks and the legendary in general. If you find yourself already struggling with uptime and handling your movement, shameless plug, I'd recommend my movement video linked below. But on a serious note, you might personally get more value from the Freezing Winds legendary. The conduits taken are the same as Shriekwing, Icy Propulsion followed by Dauntless Duelist if Venthir, Naya's Tall Spurs if Night Fae, and Ice Bite second potency conduit for all the other covenants, and if you're running Freezing Winds. A niche tip here is that the auto time is a great defensive on this fight. If you have Gluttonous Miasma during Expunge, you can auto time, run and drop your ball, and auto time back to recover any lost health. This is a tricky part of the fight for other players to soak you as you all need to spread. The Expunge Consume cycle has 30 seconds between each, so auto time can be used for every other one, even if you do not have Gluttonous Miasma. You would sim this fight the same as Shriekwing, single target default settings. This takes us on to Lady Inerva Darkvein. Even though there are ad spawns on this fight, the DPS check on the boss is tight and the ads will just die to passive cleave from the raid, so functionally it's treated as a single target fight. The legendary taken here is either Slick Ice or Freezing Winds. On Heroic, where there are less ad spawns in comparison to Mythic, Slick Ice is more popular. It's worth saying here that Freezing Winds can actually compete with Slick Ice on Heroic. As you can see, Icy Veins can be maintained pretty close to 100% uptime, thanks to orbs on multiple targets proccing Icy Propulsion. So because you extend Icy Veins through to the next one, Slick Ice loses some value. This is because every time you press Icy Veins, your Slick Ice stacks reset. On Mythic, when there are even more ad spawns, Freezing Winds is favoured due to the cleave and the Icy Veins resets you're able to get, causing Slick Ice to lose some value. You want Icy Propulsion for this fight, along with every Covenant taking Ice Bite for second potency. As you're a mage, you are incredibly mobile and so should always aim to take the furthest soaks. This includes when doing the orbs. When the boss casts Concentrated Anima to spawn adds, if you're in an ice block when the cast goes out, if it targeted you, no ad will spawn. There's no way to determine if you're targeted or not beforehand, so just ice block and hope for the best. You would use default single target sim settings for this fight. Up next is Sun King's Salvation. This fight is pretty tricky to determine as simply as the others. On Mythic, you should treat the fight as funnel, similar to the Mythic Stone Legion generals, with important vulnerable phases similar to Sludgefist. On Heroic, the majority of the fight is 5+ targets with some single target phases and priority targets. With all of this said, the legendary you want to take is Freezing Winds. You might see glacial fragments here on logs, but this is purely for padding reasons. If you're progressing this boss or struggling to kill it, Freezing Winds for the meaningful damage should be taken, especially on Mythic when you need to DPS through the shield. The conduits you want to take are Icy Propulsion, followed by every Covenant taking Ice Bite as the second potency. On Mythic difficulty, the most important part of the fight for a DPS is the Cloak of Flames DPS shield. Make sure you save your Frozen Orb for it along with either a Rune of Power charge or the rune given from Icy Veins if off cooldown. Default sim settings are acceptable to run for this fight as it is a priority target fight. Artificier Xy'Mox is next. This is another single target fight. The legendary you want is Slick Ice. This is another fight with a lot of potential movement. Slick Ice is strong if you as a player are able to deal with movement well. Obviously, you can't predict if you'll get screwed over by RNG. However, if you really are struggling with movement and uptime on this fight, you would get more benefit from Freezing Winds. It's always recommended that you work on your movement and uptime in order to get better DPS though. As this is a single target fight, the conduits you want are Icy Propulsion and Dauntless Duelist if Venthyr, Naya's Tools Burst if Nightfey, and second potency Ice Bite for all the other Covenants. If you are a seed carrier on any difficulty, remember to save up your mobility spells and be prepared for it. A niche tip is that you can alter time before you go into the first portal with the seed, drop the seed on the other side and alter time back to instantly travel rather than waiting for the portal cooldown. Once again, the sim settings you would run are the default single target sim settings. Next up is the Council of Blood. Council is the first fight in the raid where us frosties can get some use out of our famous funneling. This depends on the tanks tanking all 3 bosses together, bear in mind, but they should. The legendary you want to run is Freezing Winds. The conduits you take is once again Icy Propulsion along with all Covenants taking the second potency Ice Bite. On all difficulties, the Attendant is a priority target. Try and save some procs when you see in your boss mod timers that the Attendant is due to spawn. Orb with Freezing Winds is incredibly strong here, especially on Mythic difficulty where the Attendant needs to be nuked. You'll find on Mythic progression, the Attendants not dying fast enough will be one of the reasons that you wipe. So make sure you save up some procs and nuke that Attendant. As the other bosses heal up from damage taken and you focus one boss at a time, the default sim settings are once again best to run. Sludgefist is next. This fight is pure single target with the most important part of the fight being the vulnerable windows. When the boss hits a pillar, it takes increased damage for 10 seconds. The legendary you will want to take for this fight on Mythic, and if you're struggling to kill it on Heroic, is Freezing Winds. This is to ensure you have guaranteed procs to throw at the boss when it takes increased damage. You can take Slick Ice for this fight if you are not relying on the vulnerable windows as much in order to kill it, aka if the boss is on farm. The conduits you will want to take are Icy Propulsion along with all Covenants taking second potency Ice Bite. This is to make sure those Ice Lances hitting in the vulnerable phase hit even harder. In terms of when to use Icy Veins on this fight, it's safe to press it on cooldown. You need to make sure you have an orb along with a form of Rune of Power, either used on its own or the one dropped from Icy Veins for the vulnerable windows. You can use Orb on pull, followed by Blizzard twice or once in a precast if you have enough haste, along with your standard rotation, in order to get your orb back for the first pillar. In its current state, Mirror of Torment stacks if Venthyr will not be consumed while the boss is vulnerable due to the boss being idle. Ideally, you want to use it after the vulnerable phase if it comes off cooldown around 20 seconds before the boss charges. Alter time is a great defensive on the fight. You can use it as the vulnerable phase is ending for the roar that immediately follows to regain health lost from the roar. This is incredibly helpful for your healers, plus it lines up with every pillar. Default single target sim settings are what you would use for this fight. The penultimate fight in the raid is the Stone Legion Generals. On Heroic, it's a 2-target fight. On Mythic, however, Frost really shines due to its niche, funneling. Although I covered it in my Ultimate Mythic Plus guide, I will quickly explain funneling once again. Funnel damage basically means that the more targets you have around a priority target mob, the more damage you do single target to that mob. The way this works for Frost is the more targets you have, the more blizzard ticks you get. Each blizzard tick reduces the cooldown on Frozen Orb by 0.5 seconds. The more orbs you get, the more Fingers of Frost procs you get, and the more single target nuke you gain with each proc. The legendary wanted on all difficulties of this fight is Freezing Winds. If you see Glacial Fragments on Mythic in some of the top logs, that's because it's a great legendary to pad with. For progression, and if your guild is struggling, please always take Freezing Winds for the funnel and meaningful damage. Conduits taken for this fight are Icy Propulsion, with every Covenant once again taking the second potency, Ice Bite. For Heroic, you can sim this fight with default sim settings, but change the number of bosses from 1 to 2. For Mythic, you could sim this fight default with changing the number of bosses to 5. Rounding off the raid is Sire Denathrius himself. This fight is also single target, however there are some additional priority target mobs that will spawn in Phase 2. The legendary you will want for this fight is Freezing Winds. Conduits are Icy Propulsion, along with every Covenant taking the second potency, Ice Bite. As a small padding tip, on Heroic, you can Arcane Explosion the ads in Phase 1 for some extra cheeky damage. Optimizing this fight as Frost all comes down to your movement, especially in the last phase. Try and learn the timings and where you will need to be and plan your runes accordingly. That's my number 1 tip. You would also sim this fight full single target default sim settings. To end the video, I'd like to cover rotation. I thoroughly covered rotation in my Ultimate Mythic Plus guide video. However, to save you needing to swap videos constantly, I will cover it all once again. I feel like it's very relevant in a raid guide, so practice makes perfect, right? Icy Veins is your main cooldown, which when used grants you haste. Frostbolt is your filler spell, which does little damage on its own, however has a chance to grant you Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost procs. Brain Freeze grants your Flurry 50% increased damage and makes it instant cast. Never hard cast a Flurry, only use it when you have a proc of Brain Freeze. When you do get a Brain Freeze proc, always Frostbolt before launching the Flurry, then always press Ice Lance twice after. Flurry leaves a debuff on the target called Winter's Chill, which causes the next 2 spells on the target to act as if frozen, hence why you press Ice Lance twice after. Free procs, yay! The reason you Frostbolt before is because the 3 Flurry projectiles refreshes Winter's Chill to 2 stacks, and Frostbolt hits before the last Flurry projectile. Effectively, you're shattering 3 spells instead of 2. Fingers of Frost procs make your Ice Lance deal triple damage as if the target is frozen, shattering it. Use Fingers of Frost procs when you get them. You pretty much press everything on cooldown. Profit. Single target opener without the Freezing Winds legendary would be as follows. Free cast Frostbolt, throw your orb, cast Icy Veins, cast Mirror of Torment if Venthyr, throw any Fingers of Frost procs you have. Your mirrors would usually give you a Brain Freeze proc at this point, so cast Frostbolt into Flurry and double Ice Lance after, then continue your standard rotation. The single target rotation with Freezing Winds legendary is pretty much exactly the same, except it causes you to slightly delay your Mirror of Torment cast if Venthyr until you have no more Fingers of Frost procs. It usually works out about 4 to 6 seconds after your Icy Veins cast. There's a prominent question I very often see asked and rarely see discussed, which is, when do I use my second Rune of Power? This is pretty important. In general, for single target, you rune when your next cast would be an Ice Lance. For example, Frostbolt, Brain Freeze, Rune of Power, Ice Lance, and continue your rotation. Just quickly, I'd like to cover Proc Priority, as I often see this questioned. Sometimes you'll be in the situation where you have all of the procs. If you have Fingers of Frost procs, use them. If you have a Brain Freeze proc and no Fingers of Frost procs, cast Frostbolt, Flurry, then Ice Lance. If you have both a Brain Freeze proc and a Fingers of Frost proc and are not currently casting Frostbolt, use the Fingers of Frost first, then cast Frostbolt into Flurry. If you have both Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost procs and are currently casting Frostbolt, continue the Frostbolt cast, then use Flurry and Ice Lance. Sometimes proc munching is unavoidable and cancelling casts is a bigger DPS loss overall. Thank you for watching my video. If you have found it helpful, give me a like so I know that I'm still on the right track. Feedback is always welcome. I love hearing from you guys. If there's anything you feel I missed out or anything that would be helpful for future videos, please let me know down in the comments. Once again, a massive shout out to Toe Grinder and Collarin. These big boy mages carry me with all the information in these videos. I've linked Collarin's stream down below and Toe Grinder's written mage guide if you'd like to check either of them out. Until next time, bye!